You didn't lose your manifestation. But something just happened that pushed it away, and the reason this is so dangerous is because it didn't feel like a mistake. It didn't feel like doubt. It didn't feel like fear. And it definitely didn't feel like self-sabotage. It felt normal. It felt like you were simply responding to what was in front of you, like you were being logical, grounded, aware of your reality. And that is exactly why this moment goes unnoticed, because nothing about it looks like you're going backwards while it's happening. There is no alarm, no internal signal telling you that you just disconnected from the version of yourself that had already shifted. The shift itself was real. You already moved internally, even if it didn't feel dramatic or intense. Something in your system recalibrated in a way that changed how you process reality. Your reactions weren't the same. Your thoughts didn't escalate as quickly, and the emotional charge that used to define your responses started to lose intensity. There was more space between what happened and how you responded to it. You didn't have to force that space. It was just there. And because it was subtle, your mind didn't register it as transformation, but your system was no longer operating from the same baseline. The problem is that your external reality didn't reflect that change immediately. It couldn't, because what you see around you is always structured from previous patterns, from previous decisions, from a version of you that was operating differently. So even though you changed internally, the environment still presented the same triggers, the same dynamics, the same situations that used to activate you automatically. And when those patterns showed up again, something very precise happened without you noticing. You responded to them in a way that was just slightly closer to your old identity than your new one. It wasn't a full return. It wasn't a conscious decision to go back. It was a small shift in how you interpreted something, a slight change in your emotional response, a familiar way of thinking that briefly took over because it was still available in your system. From a neuroscience perspective, this makes perfect sense. Your brain is designed to prioritize efficiency, and the fastest way for it to respond to a familiar situation is to activate the pattern that has been used the most in the past. Even if a new pattern has been introduced, it is not yet the dominant one, which means under certain conditions, especially when something in your environment feels familiar, the old response can still activate before the new one stabilizes. That brief activation is enough to create a shift in your internal state, and that internal state is what determines how you interact with reality in that moment. From a quantum perspective, this is where the observer effect becomes practical. The state you embody is not just something you experience internally. It is the lens through which reality organizes itself around you. So when you momentarily step back into the old state, even in a subtle way, you are not just having a thought or a reaction. You are reconnecting with the version of reality that corresponds to that state. You are giving it coherence again, even if only briefly. This is why it can feel like things suddenly slow down or stop. Not because the shift didn't happen, but because the continuity of that new state was interrupted. Manifestation is not about accessing a state once. It is about stabilizing it long enough for reality to reorganize around it. And stability is not broken by big mistakes. It is broken by small, unnoticed returns to what used to feel normal. These micro moments are what determine whether the new identity becomes your baseline or remains something you access temporarily. The most important part is that this doesn't happen intentionally. You are not choosing to go backwards. You are not deciding to undo your progress. You are simply responding to what appears to be reality, using patterns that are still available in your system. And because those responses feel familiar, they don't trigger any awareness that something just shifted internally. You continue as if everything is still aligned, while the state itself has already changed slightly. That is how the process gets interrupted without you realizing it. Once you begin to see this clearly, the entire perspective changes. The issue is no longer whether your manifestation is working or not, and it's no longer about doing more, thinking better, or trying harder to stay aligned. The real question becomes much more precise. Where exactly are you slipping back into the old version of yourself without noticing it? Because that is the moment that determines everything. Not the hours where you feel aligned, not the moments where everything feels clear, but the subtle, almost invisible transitions where you respond to reality in a way that reconnects you to what you already moved beyond. And the reason this matters so much is because once you can see that moment, you can stop it. Not through effort, not through control, but through recognition. Because awareness at that level doesn't require you to force a different response. It simply prevents the automatic one from taking over. And when that automatic response no longer activates in the same way, the old pattern loses its ability to stabilize itself, which means the new state finally has space to become consistent without being interrupted. What makes this even more difficult to recognize is that the moment you slip does not feel like you are going backwards. It feels like you are being realistic. It feels like you are finally seeing things clearly, like you are grounding yourself again, like you are adjusting your expectations to match what is actually happening in front of you. And because that interpretation feels intelligent, even responsible, you don't question it. You trust it. That's where the shift begins to dissolve. Because the old identity was never maintained through obvious negativity. It was maintained through subtle interpretations of reality that felt valid in the moment. It was built on conclusions that made sense based on what you could see, what you could measure, and what you had previously experienced. So when you look at your current environment and respond based on that same logic, you are not just thinking differently for a moment. You are reactivating the entire framework that created that environment in the first place. From a neurological perspective, this is the brain returning to predictive certainty. Your mind is designed to reduce uncertainty by creating explanations, by organizing information into patterns that feel stable and understandable. When something in your external reality doesn't match your internal shift, the brain tries to resolve that mismatch. And the fastest way to do that is to fall back into familiar interpretations because they already exist. They already feel coherent, and they immediately reduce the tension of not knowing. So instead of staying in the new state, which may feel less defined, less predictable, and less reinforced by your environment, you adopt an interpretation that brings back a sense of clarity. But that clarity is built on the past, not the present. It is a reconstruction of what used to be true, not a reflection of what is currently changing beneath the surface. From a quantum perspective, this is where observation becomes attachment again. You are no longer simply aware of your reality. You are assigning meaning to it in a way that anchors you back into the old structure, because meaning is not neutral. The way you interpret what you see determines the state you move into, and that state determines the version of reality you continue to reinforce. So when you look at your life and think, nothing has really changed, even if that thought feels logical, it carries a specific frequency. It aligns you with a version of yourself that is still waiting, still evaluating, still measuring progress based on external confirmation. And the moment you stabilize that perspective even briefly, you shift out of the identity that had already changed. This is why the slip is so subtle. You are not reacting emotionally in a dramatic way. You are not spiraling or falling apart. You are simply adjusting your perception in a way that feels grounded. But that adjustment is enough to reconnect you with the old baseline, because your identity is not defined by extreme moments. It is defined by what you consistently accept as true. The 1% understand this at a deeper level. They don't just control their reactions. They become extremely precise about their interpretations. They recognize that reality, especially during this transition phase, is not reliable as a reference point. Not because it is false, but because it is delayed. It is still reflecting who they used to be, not who they are stabilizing into. So instead of adjusting themselves to match what they see, they allow what they see to exist without letting it redefine them. They remove the need to immediately explain everything. They become comfortable with the gap between internal change and external confirmation. And that comfort is what protects the new identity from being overridden by the old one. Because the moment you need your reality to make sense in a familiar way, you begin to rebuild the same structure that kept you in place before. You start reconnecting with the same assumptions, the same expectations, the same interpretations that once felt normal. And even if you don't fully return to them, you move just close enough for them to regain influence. This is where most people think they need to do something more. They think they need to reinforce the new state, repeat affirmations, visualize again, or correct their thoughts more aggressively. But that is not the solution here. The issue is not a lack of alignment. It is the momentary acceptance of an interpretation that belongs to the previous version of you. And the more you try to fix it through effort, the more you stay engaged with the idea that something is wrong, which only reinforces the same loop. What actually changes everything is much simpler, but much more precise. It is the ability to notice when your perception starts shifting back toward what is familiar, even if that shift feels logical. Because once you can see that, you don't need to fight it. You don't need to replace it. You don't need to force a new thought on top of it. You simply don't follow it. And that alone prevents the old pattern from stabilizing again. This is where real control exists. Not in managing every thought, but in recognizing which interpretations you are giving authority to. And once you stop giving authority to the ones that belong to your past, even if they appear convincing, the entire process begins to move differently. What most people still don't realize is that you don't go back through big thoughts. You don't go back because you suddenly become negative, doubtful, or completely misaligned. That would be obvious. You would catch it immediately. You would know something changed. The real shift back happens in a much quieter way, in the small, almost invisible reactions that happen before you even have time to think about them. It happens in the tone of how you respond to someone. It happens in the way your body tightens slightly in a familiar situation. It happens in the microsecond where something feels the same as it used to, and instead of staying in the space you had created, you move just slightly closer to that old response. Not enough to feel like a full reaction, but enough to reconnect with it. And that's where the process gets interrupted again. Because your body was always the anchor of your old identity. Long before you consciously thought something, your system was already generating a state. That state would then produce thoughts that matched it, which made the entire loop feel automatic and real. Now that you've shifted, that loop is weakening, but it's not completely gone. The patterns still exist, just without the same strength. So when a familiar situation appears, your body briefly tries to recreate the old state. Not fully, not with the same intensity, but just enough to test if that pattern is still active. And if you follow that sensation, even slightly, you complete the loop again. The body produces the state, the mind follows with matching thoughts, and suddenly you are back in a version of yourself that you had already moved beyond. From a neuroscience perspective, this is the reinforcement of neural pathways through activation. A pathway does not need to be fully dominant to stay alive. It only needs to be activated repeatedly. Even small activations keep it relevant in your system. And that's why these subtle reactions matter more than the big ones. Because they happen more often, and they go unnoticed. From a quantum perspective, this is coherence being reestablished in the wrong direction. The state you embody, even in small moments, contributes to the overall signal you are holding. And if those small moments consistently lean toward the old identity, even slightly, they prevent the new one from stabilizing completely. Not because it's not there, but because it's being interrupted before it becomes dominant. This is why it can feel confusing. You can feel aligned in general, you can feel different, calmer, more stable, less reactive, and still experience moments where something feels off again. Those moments are not failures. They are not proof that nothing worked. They are simply the points where the old system is still trying to reassert itself. The difference is in what you do in that moment. Most people follow it automatically. They don't even realize a choice was available. The sensation appears, the reaction begins, the thought forms, and by the time they notice it, the loop is already complete. And because it feels familiar, it doesn't trigger awareness, it just feels like, this is how I respond. But that's no longer true. That's just what is still available. The shift happens when you start noticing the gap. Not the big gap between who you were and who you are becoming, but the micro gap between sensation and response. That tiny space where something begins, but doesn't fully take over. That is where your new identity exists. Because the new version of you is not defined by never feeling the old patterns again. It is defined by not automatically becoming them. And that distinction is everything. You can feel something familiar without stepping into it. You can notice a reaction starting without completing it. You can experience the beginning of the old loop without allowing it to close. And when that happens consistently, something shifts in a way that doesn't require effort. The old pattern stops finding completion. It stops reinforcing itself. It stops being confirmed as your identity. And without that confirmation, it begins to lose stability at a much faster rate. This is where manifestation actually accelerates. Not when you intensify the new state, but when you stop feeding the old one at the level where it used to be automatic. Because what created your previous reality was not what you did occasionally. It was what you repeated unconsciously without interruption. Now that unconscious repetition is breaking. And the more you allow that break to exist, without trying to fix it, without trying to control it, without trying to force a different reaction, the more space you create for the new identity to stabilize on its own. This is the part most people underestimate. They think the shift is about what they add. But at this stage, and now it's about what they stop continuing. What makes this process even more subtle is that right after you begin to slip, something else tends to happen almost immediately. You become aware that something feels slightly off again. Not in an obvious way, not like before, but just enough for you to notice that the clarity you had a moment ago is not as stable, and that awareness seems like a good thing. It feels like you are paying attention, like you are catching yourself, like you are about to correct the direction. But this is where another layer of interference begins, because the moment you try to fix it, you re-engage with it. Most people, when they notice a shift in their state, immediately try to do something about it. They try to think differently, adjust their emotions, reframe the situation, return to the right mindset, or bring themselves back into alignment. And on the surface, that looks like control. It looks like awareness. It looks like discipline. But underneath that effort, there is an assumption that something went wrong. And that assumption is what keeps the loop active, because the moment you believe something needs to be fixed, you are no longer operating from the identity that already shifted. You are operating from the version of you that is still trying to get there. You are reinforcing the idea that alignment is fragile, that it can break easily, that it needs constant management to exist. From a neurological perspective, this activates the same control circuits that were part of your old identity. The need to monitor, adjust, and correct is not neutral. It is a pattern. And that pattern was originally built to maintain stability through control, not through coherence. So even though your intention is to return to alignment, the mechanism you are using belongs to the version of you that was not yet stable. And that creates contradiction. From a quantum perspective, this becomes even more precise, because the field does not respond to what you are trying to fix. It responds to the state you are stabilizing. And the act of fixing carries a very specific signal. It carries the signal that something is not complete, not aligned, not fully established yet. So even if you are thinking the right thoughts, the underlying state is still one of correction. And correction implies incompleteness. And that incompleteness delays stabilization. This is why the more you try to get back into the state, the more it feels like something is slightly out of reach. Because you are no longer in it. You are approaching it. You are trying to return to it. And that movement creates distance even if it is subtle. The 1% understand something very different at this stage. When they notice a shift, they don't immediately react to it. They don't try to correct it, analyze it, or bring themselves back into anything. They recognize it, and then they don't follow it. That's the difference. They allow the moment to pass without turning it into a problem. They allow the sensation to exist without building a response around it. They allow the slight misalignment to dissolve on its own without interfering, because they understand something most people don't. Not every shift needs to be fixed. Some just need to not be fed. And that changes everything. Because when you stop reacting to the moment where things feel slightly off, you stop reinforcing it. You stop giving it structure. You stop turning it into a new loop. And without that reinforcement, it cannot stabilize. It appears, but it doesn't grow. It starts, but it doesn't complete. And over time, that changes the entire dynamic of your system. Because now, instead of constantly correcting yourself, you are allowing the new identity to remain without interruption. And that is what creates real stability. This is the part that most people skip. Because it doesn't feel active. It doesn't feel like you are doing something. It feels like you are doing less. But that less is exactly what removes the interference that was keeping the old patterns alive. And once that interference is gone, something locks in. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. And when that consistency reaches a certain point, the old pattern no longer has enough activation to reestablish itself in the same way. It loses access, it loses speed, it loses influence. And that's when the shift stops feeling fragile and starts feeling natural. Because now you are no longer trying to stay in the new state. You are no longer trying to maintain it. You are no longer trying to fix anything that moves. You are simply not returning to what you already left. And that is what makes the change irreversible. At this point, the biggest misunderstanding starts to dissolve, and what replaces it is something much more precise. You didn't ruin your manifestation. You didn't destroy your progress. You didn't go all the way back to where you were before. What actually happened is much simpler and at the same time, much more important than that. You just didn't stay, because staying is what stabilizes the shift. Everything you experienced before this moment was real. The change in your reactions, the space you felt in your mind, the reduction in emotional intensity, the sense that something internally had moved without needing external confirmation. That wasn't temporary, and it wasn't imagined. It was the beginning of a new baseline forming. But a baseline only becomes real when it is continuous. And continuity is where most people break the process. Not through big mistakes, not through obvious doubt, not through dramatic emotional reactions, but through small interruptions that prevent the state from becoming consistent enough to stabilize. Every time you slipped into an old interpretation, every time you followed a familiar reaction, every time you tried to fix what didn't need fixing, you momentarily stepped out of the state, and that moment matters more than it seems. Because from a neurological perspective, stability is not created by intensity. It is created by repetition without interruption. A new neural pathway does not need to be strong at first, but it needs to be uninterrupted long enough to become the default. And every time you return to the old pattern, even briefly, you delay that transition. You don't erase the new pattern, but you prevent it from becoming dominant. From a quantum perspective, this becomes even more exact. The field does not respond to isolated moments of alignment. It responds to sustained coherence. It responds to the version of you that remains consistent without collapsing back into previous states. And when that consistency is broken, even subtly, the reorganization of reality slows down, not because it stopped, but because the signal is no longer stable enough to fully collapse. This is why it feels like something almost worked. Like you were close. Like you had it, and then something slipped away. But nothing slipped away. You stepped out, just long enough to interrupt the continuity, and that distinction changes everything. Because now the solution is no longer about trying harder, thinking better, or fixing your process. It becomes much more precise than that. It becomes about staying in the state without interruption, not perfectly, not forcefully, but consistently enough that the old patterns no longer have space to reestablish themselves. This is where the shift becomes real. Not when you feel it strongly, not when you think about it clearly, but when you remain in it, without leaving. And staying does not mean holding a perfect state. It does not mean controlling every thought or eliminating every reaction. It means something much simpler. It means not following what pulls you back. It means allowing the old pattern to appear without completing it. It means recognizing the moment where you would have gone back and not going. That's it. And when you do that, something stabilizes in a way that doesn't require effort anymore. Because now, the new identity is no longer something you access. It becomes something you don't leave. And once that happens, the process no longer depends on awareness in the same way. You are no longer catching yourself constantly. You are no longer managing your state. You are no longer trying to stay aligned. You simply are. And from that point, manifestation stops feeling fragile. It stops feeling like something that can break. It stops feeling like something you can lose. Because now, it is not something you are doing. It is something you are no longer interrupting. And that is the moment where everything begins to move again. Not because you forced it, not because you fixed something, but because you finally allowed the state to remain long enough to become real. If you've reached this level of awareness and you can recognize these subtle moments where you used to go back, that's exactly why I created the Awaken Your Quantum Power Guide. It's designed to help you stabilize this identity without effort, without overthinking, and without falling into the same invisible patterns. You'll find it in the pinned comment, because at this stage, the shift is no longer about learning more. It's about becoming consistent. At a certain point in this process, something changes in a way that is difficult to explain if you haven't experienced it yet, because it doesn't feel like effort, it doesn't feel like control, and it doesn't feel like you are actively doing anything differently. What changes is not what you are doing. It's what is no longer available for you to do in the same way. The version of you that used to go back stops responding the same way, not because you are forcing yourself to move forward, but because going back no longer feels natural. Up until now, there was always a subtle pull, a familiarity in certain reactions, a comfort in certain interpretations, a tendency to return to ways of thinking that once felt automatic. Even if you had already shifted, that pull was still present in small moments, in subtle responses, in almost invisible decisions that happened before you became aware of them. But as you stop feeding those patterns, something very specific begins to happen. They lose accessibility. From a neurological perspective, pathways that are no longer activated begin to weaken progressively. The brain starts prioritizing the patterns that are used consistently, and anything that is not being reinforced loses efficiency. It becomes slower, less automatic, less available in real time, until it reaches a point where it is no longer the default response. From a quantum perspective, this is coherence becoming exclusive. You are no longer fluctuating between different versions of yourself. You are no longer shifting between states depending on what happens around you. You are stabilized as one observer, one identity, one consistent signal. And because of that, there is no alternative state strong enough to pull you out of it in the same way. This is where the process becomes irreversible. Not because you decided it would be, but because the version of you that used to interrupt it is no longer active. This is the moment where you realize that you are not trying to stay anymore. You are not catching yourself constantly